This second Sunday of Lent gives us another wonderful set of readings that are just so filled with very important symbolism and stories that are behind those symbols for us to unpack. I really think Lent is much more like the Christmas season than sometimes Christmas is, because each set of readings we get in each set of the season is so rich and so important to our sense of our historic faith journey. Now, the images that really quite literally come out of this for me is these two animals that get lifted up in the images of our gospel writer in Luke. And if you notice, there are two animals that first appear. I wonder if anyone notices the first one. What is Herod? A fox, yeah, a fox. And then later on, in this sort of series of sayings that have been put together into one reading, Jesus says something about himself, and he uses an image about himself. And what's that animal? A hen. A fox and a hen. Interesting. We have a sense of what that means, fox and hen. Fox getting in the hen house, right? That goes back as long as I ever knew, as long as America ever knew. I think there's a piece of our folklore about fox and hen. And in fact, those images, the stories about the wiliness of a fox and the predicament of the hen are stories that actually go back millennia in human history. We have literally been talking about foxes and hens for almost 3,000 years. At least 2,500. It's one of those kind of imbued set of symbols that when we see them, we want to ask the question. We have a sense of what that might mean to us, but what did it mean to that Greco-Roman culture to which and in which the experience of Christ is happening and the gospel writer of Luke is writing? So I want to share with you a couple short stories that the Greco-Roman world in which Jesus and his apostles were living would have been familiar with these two Greek stories. Lots of Greek stories. They would have known all the stories about the Greek gods and goddesses and all the folk tales we know as Aesop's. They would have known all kinds of Roman stories, but here's just two that the people reading this and writing this would have known. The first is about an old story in Greek mythology about a giant beast called the Tumessian fox. The Tumessian fox is an enormous giant fox, a gigantic fox. It was magical in that it was destined never to be caught, this fox. It was said that it had been sent by the gods to prey upon the children and the people of Thebes as a punishment for some national crime that they had committed against the gods. Well, Creon, who was the regent or king of Thebes at the time, set his general, I love this name, Amphitryon. Name your dog that. Here, Amphitryon, come on. It's a good name. The impossible task. He assigns his general the impossible task of destroying the beast. And he discovers, in his pursuit, the general discovers an apparently perfect solution to the problem by fetching a magical dog named Lelax. Now that's a good dog name, Lelax, who was destined, his own magical destiny, destined to catch everything it chased. So, just to recap, the Tumessian fox, destined never to be caught, and Lelax, the dog, destined to always catch what it chases. This set up a mythical conundrum for the great god Zeus, who was faced with a contradiction. One could never be caught, the other one would always catch. And so, faced with this, he turns both the fox and the dog into stone. It's one way to deal with the problem. Later on, they are further mythologized by being associated with constellations of stars that we know today as Canis Major, That would be the dog Laelax. And Canis Minor, that would be Dutumessian fox. Here's another story that the worldly apostles and writers would have known. It's a story about a very wise rooster. And this wise rooster, who was seeking wisdom, wandered the world in relentless pursuit of his quest of knowledge and wisdom. Until one day he came across a very large and beautiful gem. And as he contemplated this gem for some time and strutted around it and reflected upon it, he at last concluded, I would give this gem and all else of mine for even a single grain of corn. That's a wise rooster. The corn can give him life, but not this gem. And that was lifted up in Greco-Roman philosophies as the pursuit of things, luxuries, wealth, cannot ultimately satisfy human needs. Now, both of those stories, I think, definitely can inform us, and I believe informed the people for whom Luke was writing. The fox and this chicken. Now, it just so happens that I also am reading right now a wonderful history book, very carefully researched. It's called Why Did the Chicken Cross the World? It's a great book by Andrew Lawler, a scientist, and he's done meticulous research on the role of the chicken in human society and development. And he traces how it started out as this rangy-looking tropical thing and was taken out of the rainforest and domesticated and becomes basically so important in cultures throughout the world. We think, for example, that the chicken wandered its way from Asia into the hands of the industrious Persians who traded it, and eventually then was introduced at least 2,500 years ago into Israel and became a real staple very quickly. But at first it was used as a sacrificial animal only and was considered quite sacred, and so only used in religious prayer and sacrifice. Ultimately, it does eventually become something that people eat and becomes a staple in the diet, but is also still used in certain kinds of ritual, but only a particular kind of chicken. A hen that was white. But that's connected up to an earlier Greek tradition of sacrificing white chickens to the god of healing and resurrection, known as Asclepius in the Greek pantheon. Several times, the gospel writers make allusions in equating some of the symbol systems of the Hebrews and the early Christian church to the god Asclepius. I mentioned some of that before, so I won't repeat it, but I think that's happening again here, because the god Asclepius was considered the chicken, especially a white one, to be the preferred sacrifice for those seeking healing or those who once healed were giving thanks to the god Asclepius. In fact, even as he was dying from ingesting poison, Socrates told his friend, make sure you sacrifice the rooster to Asclepius. Even as he was dying, his belief in the power of resurrection is a belief that the early Christian community would have found very salient to their teachings around Christ. The fox and the chicken. Now here we are, come with me on my pilgrimage, even just last January, to Israel. And for the second time in my life, I had the opportunity to go with a group up to the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is on the other side of a valley and from Jerusalem. So here's Olives, here's your valley, here's Jerusalem. When you go up on the Mount of Olives, you have a beautiful overlook of all of Jerusalem, including what would have been the old temple precinct. In fact, it's so good that when they created a chapel in that place on the Mount of Olives, they didn't put in any stained glass. You can stand in a chapel and have the full view over to Jerusalem. In fact, this chapel is called the Dominus Flevit, the Lord wept. And it commemorates this moment, this story of Jesus weeping, lamenting over Jerusalem, and saying, how long I have longed for you to be gathered to me, just as a hen would gather her chicks. Now, if you go to Dominus Flevit, you'll see this beautiful stone altar with these windows behind it with the view. But on the front of the altar is a very fine old mosaic of, guess what? A white hen with her wings outstretched, gathering chicks around her. It's a very powerful set of imagery. The Lord weeping over Jerusalem and its fate, longing to gather like a hen gathers her chicks. It is, I think, no accident that when these Pharisees come to Jesus and they say, presumably, it almost sounds like they're trying to protect him, you should go because Herod's looking for you. But in fact, I think that they simply do not want trouble in Jerusalem. And they do not want anyone confronting Herod and creating trouble for them who are in power. They're certainly operating in their own best interest. And for Jesus to basically look at them and say, oh, go away. It's his first word. Go. Just go. Get out of here. Because go tell that fox. And I think in many ways the parallel is there. Not only is he saying that he's wily, I think he is comparing Herod to the Themestian fox. The idea of a vengeful beast taking out punishment on the people, but this time not of Thebes, but of Jerusalem. In fact, many of the Hebrews of the time wondered if the reason that they'd been saddled with Herod and the Roman Empire wasn't because of some great sin that they had committed against Yahweh. They wondered, did we deserve this punishment? And what can we possibly be doing to live a more righteous life? And yet, this punishment came, and those who were corrupted to the power of Rome were certainly part of the problem. But Jesus and God do not send a dog after this fox. It's a hen. The very thing that you would think would be the victim of the fox. The very thing that you would think might have the least possible power. And yet, a very strong and important image of protection of those even more vulnerable. And also, the perfect sacrifice associated with a God of healing, resurrection. Healing being associated always, not just as a physical action, but a spiritual one. When a person is healed in that set of beliefs, a person's sins are forgiven. A sacrifice is always about expiation of sin, being forgiven, and being healed. It was that same meaning in many belief systems of the area. It was a universal sign. Notice for just a moment, in the Old Testament reading we heard, that when God sets the initial covenant with Abraham, that the person, it's not really Abraham making his sacrifice of himself, but he is gathering all these sacrificial animals. Notice how a special mention is made that while all of them are cut in half, and God walks between those halves, the birds are not cut in half, but are left whole as a whole offering. And again, if Jesus, as the sacrifice made by God in order to forgive sins of the people of Jerusalem and of all the world, he is not rendered or hurt in body in terms of being split in half, but remains whole. Notice again, wings wide open, an exposed breast of vulnerability, and those who would have gathered at the foot of the cross. In fact, there on a hill at his feet, all of Jerusalem. What he so longed to have happen ultimately happened, gathering all those who loved him under his wings. This image of sacrifice on our behalf, this image of a vulnerable God who through the very act of being victim is actually the one giving the most power to all the people. The fox is trapped because of the nature of the fox. And the people are saved because of the nature of God. And so, my friends, I invite you, as Luke does, to reflect this Lent on where you need healing and where our community needs healing, or relationships or world. And consider the response here is not to stick the dogs on people, but to spread our wings wide open, bare our vulnerable chest, and gather those who need us under our wings. In Christ's name, amen.